Hello again. If you're new to the channel, welcome in. I'm Unchained Skeptic, but you can call me Hugh. My channel is currently focused on the discussion of religion, from jokes about it, to the deconstruction of religious beliefs, to a discussion about the truth of its claims, and hopefully eventually to a showcase of its practices around the world. Part of the reason I talk about this is because I'm currently an agnostic atheist, and I haven't believed in the existence of a God in about 10 years as of the recording of this video. I used to believe in a God. In particular, I was a Christian until I was 19. Here's a story of why I left. So I was raised and indoctrinated into Christianity by my parents and believed in God because that's the truth that was told to me from about as far back as I can remember. While I believed that the version of Christianity that I was raised with was true, I didn't have my born again moment until I was about 12 years old. That was when I went from simply believing that God existed and that Jesus died for us and all that good stuff to fully wanting to dedicate my life to God. I got baptized 3 years later when I was 15. Growing up, the churches my family and I went to were Baptist churches. They stopped going to church sometime during my early teens, and I started going with just my grandmother, and then I started going alone after her health issues stopped her from being able to make the trip every week. A couple of months after my baptism, the pastor at the last Baptist church I attended got exposed for cheating on his wife with multiple women in the congregation throughout the years. So after that, I chose a new church home and they were apostolic. I was a big fan of this church when I was in it, to the point that I was even witnessing with a few other members before service started on Sunday. I met good friends, I always enjoyed the service, and I even wanted to be a Bible teacher myself. The issue is, at this point, I'd never read the entire Bible. That's when I decided to actually read the Bible for myself and to do what I thought was right by God. Funny enough, that's when my deconstruction started. See, growing up, the version of God that I was preached and taught was a version of God that's almighty and perfect and that's good all of the time. However, that was not the version of God I read about in the Bible. The God I read about in the Bible was a monster who condoned things like slavery and rape and who commanded the death of children, among other awful things. As terrible as those things are, one of the most distinct things that really started my questioning of the logic of it all was the recurring theme throughout the Bible of blind obedience and the rejection of worldly wisdom, as it's referred to in 1 Corinthians chapter 1. To elaborate, I was an honor roll student growing up, and logically it just seemed odd to me that, for example, God would create my brain and the brains of people smarter and wiser than me, but also bless Solomon with the wisdom to tell people to not lean on their own understanding like he does in Proverbs chapter 3 verse 5. Or how God would consider accepting things without evidence to be a virtue, which he communicated to Thomas in John chapter 20 verse 29. I used to believe this so fully that it made no sense to me that something I found so self-evident would try to indirectly reward blind acceptance of it. If it stood up to scrutiny, it wouldn't matter if someone scrutinized it. If it were the truth, it wouldn't mind being questioned. Now, I still have faith that God existed in spite of this, but like most Christians, I didn't want to think negatively of God. Both because of the contradiction with the nature of God that I've been preached up until that point, and also because I didn't want to go to hell for it. So I started getting heavy into apologetics to figure out why God seemingly condoned such awful things, and seemingly did such awful things, and seemingly commanded such awful things. Apologists, both in person and on the forums I was in, always seemed to have an answer for all of these things. At first, it was comforting knowing I could lean on at least someone's words when I was having a moral conflict with the God of the Bible, but then I realized two things. One was that they always had an answer, which was suspicious to me because, as I said earlier, I thought God was the only perfect thing that existed. By extension, I didn't believe that any of the prophets or writers were perfect, which would logically lead to a Bible where there simply isn't an explanation for every single thing in it. The other thing I realized is that some of the answers I received contradicted other answers. There are too many examples to go over, but see for yourself. Look up apologetics for any seeming moral issue in the Bible and check multiple publications and forums for their hermeneutic. And I promise you'll see multiple contradictory answers. I didn't expect that to be the case if verses like John chapter 16 verse 13 were true, and that we were all guided by the Holy Spirit into all truth as followers of Christ. They got me thinking that most apologists at minimum and no apologists at maximum knew what the hell they were talking about. And maybe the intentions of apologetics weren't entirely to explain the truth, but to instead preach to the choir and give doubters something to lean back on. Even past the point of intellectual honesty. That's what started me questioning if any of it was real in the first place. I still thought that it was at this point, but this is the point that I decided to leave the church and seek solid evidence for myself, since I didn't want to be in God's house every week while I was having doubts about who he was. I thought I'd maybe miss a single Sunday, maybe two, but here we are 10 years later. Anyway, at this point, my intention was to find at least one compelling piece of evidence that passed all scrutiny, so that I could live my life for God knowing without a shadow of a doubt that he was real, since I had at least one bit of proof to lean on even in the toughest of times. So I prayed and fasted and kept praying for help with my faith or a sign that he was real, and I got nothing. I looked into the logical and philosophical arguments for God and found none of them convincing for separate reasons. Most commonly, they were fallacious or built off of an unfounded assumption or misunderstood science in some way. I looked at the historical evidence and found that there wasn't any contemporary or even reliable evidence supporting the resurrection or any other supernatural event in the Bible. I looked at the archaeological evidence and saw nothing but hoaxes, forgeries, and unsubstantiated claims by multiple parties looking for fame. At that point, I started to reassess my beliefs, and one common theme throughout that reassessment was the seemingly human intentions, actions, and preferences of God, which didn't make any sense to me. I'll give a few examples. I mentioned earlier that God condones slavery in the Bible, and one common explanation I've heard in the past 10 years is that since people were enslaving each other anyway, he just gave guidelines on who could be bought or how they were to be treated. However, I still thought of God as being almighty, so it made zero sense to me that God would be obliged to follow human societal expectations and laws, especially when he had no issue communicating his distaste for the things that he didn't approve of, like having other gods before him, or murder, or theft, or adultery. It made a lot of sense, however, that either God was just written as a character reflection of humans who condone slavery, or that God actually condones it himself. Another example is God being described as jealous like he is in the second commandment. It didn't make sense to me that a being powerful enough to create this vast, complex universe would be jealous of the other gods that some random hairless apes on a water-covered space marble could conceive of. It made perfect sense to me, though, that God would be written this way by a human who wanted those aware of Jewish or Christian doctrine to be guilty for believing in something that went against the book they made up. This was made even more apparent when I learned the history of how the religion spread to my part of the planet. All of this questioning ended on one random day in 2015, about a year and a half since I had gotten to the parts of the Bible that started my questioning. I was sitting there in my room looking into yet another argument that I combed over a few times already by now, and then it hit me. I'd always known that God is invisible, odorless, and otherwise physically undetectable and immaterial. But at this point, I realized that God is also logically unsubstantial. I'd also gone about a year and a half without having any of my prayers for faith or a sign answered, so it was also safe to say that God also has the quality of not answering back. To the best of my knowledge, I call such things non-existent when they have such qualities. I then asked myself why I was holding God to a different evidential standard, and I thought about it long and hard in that same spot for about 7 or so hours. Then I realized that I simply didn't have a good logical answer for myself. That's the moment I knew I was an atheist. I said one final prayer to God, basically saying that I no longer believed that he existed and that I was talking to myself. But in case I was wrong, he'd always know where to find me if he ever wanted to answer that prayer and if I was too quick with giving him the quality of inaudibility. So that's the story of why I stopped believing in God. Here are some untrue reasons that I commonly get accused of by Christians, especially when doing this type of content. I didn't stop believing that God exists because I never actually believed in the first place. I did, and if you don't believe me, then I don't know what to tell you. Maybe you, as someone who doesn't even know me, actually know more about me than I do and aren't just trying to invalidate my former beliefs so you can keep your religion beyond reproach in your own mind. I didn't stop believing in God because I never heard your particular logical argument. On the lowest, most conservative possible estimation I can grant, I'd honestly say I've heard even the most unique arguments at least 100 times before over the past 10 years. And the most common ones I probably heard about 1,000 times, maybe more. I didn't stop believing that God exists because I never felt the Holy Spirit. I've had what Christians claim are encounters with the Holy Spirit. However, fun fact, I've mostly had these encounters in church when the trance-like music was playing. I've also felt a similar feeling at some of the concerts I've been to, or when I was smoking pot lying down on the grass looking up at the night sky on my friend's farm, or when I was getting intimate with someone I was in love with. It makes far more sense that the Holy Spirit I felt is just a natural sense of euphoria, and it makes little sense that the Holy Spirit was falling on me when I was engaging in premarital sexual activities with my exes. I didn't stop believing that God exists because I just wanted to sin without judgment. On the contrary, actually. If I loved sinning so much without judgment, I would have just remained a Christian and did what people like Ted Bundy or Jeffrey Dahmer did and repented from my wrongdoings. Assuming one could even arbitrarily choose their beliefs in the first place, it would be far less efficient to leave one's religion, knowing that the God they believe in is real and judging them regardless, than it would be to just ask for forgiveness like you can do in Christianity if the intention is to go to heaven. I didn't stop believing that God exists because I didn't read the Bible. As of the recording of this video, I've read the Bible twice. In fact, if you remember earlier in the video and don't think I'm a liar, reading the Bible is the very thing that made me start questioning my beliefs in the first place. I didn't stop believing that God exists because I was hurt by someone in or out of the church. I've gotten this one quite often, and the disgusting lack of empathy and condescension aside, it's logically possible for one to believe in God and also for one to believe that the people claiming to be followers of God are bad people. There's no contradiction there. And I even enjoyed my church environment most toward the point that I started questioning my beliefs. In fact, if I'm going to be vulnerable for a second, church was my weekly retreat from an otherwise chaotic existence. I didn't stop believing that God exists because I was tricked by Satan, or at the absolute very least, it seems highly unlikely. It makes far more sense that the hundreds of hours of logical dissection I performed of my faith gave justifiable results, rather than that an immaterial, logically unsubstantial, inaudible force made the universe such that his existence would seem unlikely, and that my conclusion that he doesn't exist is the result of trickery by another immaterial, logically unsubstantial, inaudible deus ex machina. As a former Christian myself, I fully understand thinking so highly of the religion that it's hard to understand how someone can go from genuinely believing it to be true and then using logic alone to come to a new conclusion that it's false. That being said, if it's a genuine discussion with former Christians that you're after, then accusing them of lying about the authenticity of their former faith or their motivations for not believing anymore won't get you very far. If it's instead some condescension or meanness that you're after so that you can feel better about your own life, or it's satisfaction that you're after by hearing someone defend your faith for you by defending their former faith, then this simply isn't the channel for you. I'm going to end this video by letting any Christians who see this as an opportunity to preach know that I'm not interested. I can promise that the paragraphs you might want to type out would only serve to make you feel better or give you a false sense of productivity to the conversation, and not to make me rethink my conclusion about God, so you can save your time if you like to. I'd also want to let anyone who's getting ready to pick one thing I said out of the video to give apologetics for, while ignoring both the rest of the video as well as the hundreds of hours of research I've done into this topic that I haven't even begun to touch on in this video alone, that you don't have the full picture, so you don't have to take it upon yourself to pick at one thing that you're convinced I got incorrect if your expectation is to try to convert me back. Your biblical knowledge or apologetics proclivity is admirable, but not only would it be impossible for you to undo the many hours of things I've learned on my own, but most importantly, I'm not your project. I'm not another soul to save, and I'm not another debate to win. I'm a person just like you with about 30 years of lore that you'll never know the entirety of from a 15-minute long video. If you are interested in getting to actually know more about me though, my primary form of content is live streaming both here on YouTube as well as multiple other platforms. So if you'd like to keep up with my content, my journey, and my thoughts, make sure to subscribe to the channel. If you'd like to follow me on any of my other platforms, to talk in private, or if you'd like to support what I do here, go to beacons.ai/unchainedskeptic and it'll have the links to all of my current socials and platforms. I hope this video shed some light on my former beliefs. Thank you for watching and take care.